Victor. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our event with our guest speaker, Professor Robert Percival from the University of Maryland. I'm Aubin, and I'm delighted to say a word about our program, which is funded by the European Commission through the H2020 and Mercury Action programs. And this month, our series will also feature Professor Tibise Morgandi from Queen Mary University of London on December 15th on energy security in international law. Feel free to visit our website, www.law.uh.edu/INAR-Center, where you will find the upcoming events in the series and also access for free our archive with a lot more recording of our past events. Now I'll turn it over to Professor Victor Flatt, the co-director of our center and our chair this morning.
Thank you, Aubin. So again, we are so delighted to be able to be partnered with the Université de Lyon 3 and the European Union to present this multi-year series of programming on the transition in energy governance as we see this issue keeps growing more and more. As Aubin noted, the recordings are on our website, and we have some excellent speakers coming up, but we have also heard in the past from a broad array of perspectives on all of the various issues of the energy transition and policy that's necessary to move us toward a less carbon-intensive future. These include Lisa Sachs from Columbia, Will Burns from America, and Lisa Benjamin from Lewis and Clark, Rebecca Bratspies from CUNY, Uma Autka from Kansas, Josh Galperin from Pittsburgh, Alexandra Klass from the University of Minnesota, Professor Roy Partain from the University of Aberdeen, Lee Paddock from GW University Law School, and Gabe Patsiniak from University of New Mexico, and Melissa Scanlon from Boston College. So we have been very fortunate to have an extremely good array of speakers. And I have to say that adding to this is it's hard to imagine anybody that has more accolades, and that is Professor Percival from the University of Maryland Law Center. Most of you know Professor Percival or have heard of Professor Percival, but I will just give you a little bit of a background about him. He is a graduate of Macalester College and graduated first in his class from Stanford Law School. He clerked for Shirley Huffstedler on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and for Justice Byron White on the U.S. Supreme Court. His research and writings are extensive and well known, not only in the domestic field of environmental law, but particularly in the international realm and the relation of international environmental law to domestic law. And again, with yet another particular emphasis on climate change. He is the author of probably the most successful environmental law casebook in use today, now in its 9th edition, as well as writings for international environmental law as well. I believe a founding member and also certainly one of the drivers of the IUCN. So it's a great pleasure to have Professor Percival here. I've enjoyed our personal relations and our collegial relations as well. So Professor Percival today has an intriguing concept when we talk about the energy transition in governance, and that is, are democracies capable of responding effectively to the global climate crisis? This is a question that many of us have thought of and pondered as we have watched what we consider to be more totalitarian regimes able to turn on a dime or change policies more rapidly, and the great lag that we seem to have from recognizing that we do have a crisis to actually being able to make effective change to address that crisis. So it's an extremely important question, and it comes amid the background of concerns that we are in fact moving around the world towards more authoritarian regimes and illiberal democracies, which are problematic, of course, on many levels. So with that, I am going to allow this issue to be more fully explored and explained by Professor Percival. We'll allow him 30 to 40, 45 minutes, whatever he wants to speak. I will be keeping the queue for questions. Please share those questions in the chat function. And we will have an open floor for questions additionally. Also, we will have a CLE credit number for this available, which will be shown at the end. So with that, I would like to turn the program over to Professor Percival.
Thank you so much, Victor. It's really a pleasure to be here. Not necessarily a pleasure to be on Zoom. We're all sick of Zoom. But one thing I can see is that this is really a great audience. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. The impetus for this talk was a book project that I was a part of that was published in 2018 called Constitutional Democracies in Crisis. I think it was spurred by the election of Donald Trump and the early maneuvers by the Trump administration. Three prominent U.S. constitutional law scholars, Mark Graber from my own University of Maryland, Sandy Levinson, and Mark Tushnet, put together an extraordinary group of essays from scholars all over the world that looked at the erosion of democracy throughout the world. And it only seems to this trend seems to have continued since then. If you look at the Freedom House Democracy Index, Freedom House tracks every year and ranks countries on how democratic they are. And you can see that the green there is free, the yellow is partly free, and the purple is not free. And that's their rating for 2019. It was interrupted a little by the pandemic, but in 2020, it just seemed to get worse. Now, of course, one question, and it's one that's being debated quite a lot now, because today is really day zero of the summit of democracies that President Biden has called, is how do you define democracy? And in the Freedom House rankings, they look at whether or not governments are accountable to the public. Does the rule of law prevail? Is there freedom of expression and association, respect for minority rights? And the trend has been not a good one for those who believe in the importance of these values. I would only cite among the countries, a country that's near and dear to my heart, the country of Chile, where my daughter was born. She's adopted from Chile. And even during the Pinochet dictatorship that had interrupted a very long history of respect for the rule of law and democracy, the rule of law was still so strong that when a courageous young woman judge announced that she was going to approve a foreign adoption, despite the opposition of Pinochet's wife to all foreign adoptions, the rule of law prevailed and we were able to adopt our daughter from Chile. But what's happened to Chile in recent years, they're finally in the process of adopting a new constitution that will get rid of the undemocratic vestiges of the Pinochet regime, where the military had automatic seats in the Senate and the like. And the commission that drafted it had great representation from environmentalists, so there's some terrific environmental rights provisions in the new constitution. But in 2 weeks, they're having their national election. And because so many candidates ran, all the moderates split the vote. So in 2 weeks, Chile has to choose between a very far right candidate and a former leftist student activist, something that is greatly distressing the majority of the Chilean population who want to move in a more moderate direction. You can see there how this chart, the number of countries that declined versus the number of countries that improved on these democratic indicators, the trend is not good. And in part, it's because of countries like Turkey, Hungary, Israel, and the Philippines, where the government became more authoritarian. Now, of course, Netanyahu is no longer in charge and is actually on trial now for corruption. In Israel, Duterte is sort of stepping down in the Philippines. But you can see that there are a number of factors contributing to this. The faltering of post-Cold War democratization. I witnessed that when I was teaching as a Fulbright scholar in Slovakia just after the fall of the Soviet Union. And one of the problems was that the only people who were well known as political figures were the former Communist Party bosses. And so they had disastrous national elections in the aftermath of communism. Things have improved a bit in recent years there. And the climate change problem just sort of multiplies the difficulties of democracy being able to cope with it. Start with Mansur Olson's logic of collective action. He argued that if you have a problem where the policies to deal with it are going to impose concentrated costs that will be felt in the short run by politically influential industries, it will be easier for them to prevail and block what would be long-term diffuse benefits to the general population. Professor Richard Lazarus, in a 2009 article called Super Wicked Problems and Climate Change, Restraining the Present to Liberate the Future, argued that the climate change problem was a classic illustration of this. And we might need to consider things like creating a politically independent body akin to the Federal Reserve Board that would bind the future in order to deal with a long-term problem. Now, the UK in 2008 adopted the Climate Change Act that did create a body, the Climate Change Committee, that was independent and charged with advising the UK government on what needs to be done to set carbon budgets and to adopt policies that will enable it to meet its targets for coping with the climate change problem. That at least had the virtue of being spurred by the Tory party agreeing that it needed to appeal to younger voters who were concerned about environmental issues. And so there was kind of a near consensus on creating this. It doesn't mean that the body's powerful like the Federal Reserve Board and able to do things that the parties oppose, but it is part of the model that Lazarus was building upon. Now, if you go back and look at the history of US efforts, I think there's a long series of political lessons that we would be wise to keep in mind. Take us back to 1992, the Rio Earth Summit. This is where the Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted. And President George H.W. Bush, in the midst of a re-election campaign where he was being opposed by both Bill Clinton and Ross Perot, went to the Rio Earth Summit. His main goal was to make sure that the Framework Convention itself did not include any specific limits on greenhouse gas emissions. Those would be negotiated later. But to his credit, he signed the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And this is something that always amazes my students. I say, did the US Senate ratify the Framework Convention on Climate Change? Bush signed it when it was negotiated in June 1992. He submitted it to the Senate for ratification, and it was ratified unanimously by the Senate in October of 1992, which is what gives us a seat at the table at all the future climate negotiations. Ultimately, Bush lost to Bill Clinton, and Clinton becomes president in 1993. And part of the centerpiece of his plan for reviving the economy that had been in what now looks like a fairly small recession was to enact a broad-based energy tax that he said would be a much more efficient way of raising revenue and would create incentives to conserve energy and ensure that it was used more efficiently. The demise of this BTU tax for British thermal units, as it was initially called, I think created what's been considered an indelible political lesson in the United States, and that is that you cannot advocate for new taxes, particularly energy taxes that might ultimately be borne by consumers. You might recall George H.W. Bush had famously said, "Read my lips, no new taxes," and then had to renege on that pledge, which is one of the things that that hurt him. It was actually Ronald Reagan that did that, his predecessor. But here, this was the first major defeat by the Clinton administration. And ever since, ideas like a carbon tax have actually been kind of anathema. But the strange political reluctance to advocate for policies to combat climate change, I think, was borne out in the 2000 election, where you had Al Gore, who had been the author of the book Earth in the Balance, where he said the global climate crisis was such a serious problem that the role of government, the central organizing principle of civilization, should be how to combat it. And yet during the presidential campaign, he said very little about the environment and never once mentioned it in the presidential debates. He could have said at the time, George W. Bush was actually supporting the effort in the American trucking case to have the Clean Air Act declared unconstitutional. He could have mentioned that in the debate. No, he didn't mention it at all. However, at the same time, and I think there's sort of a duality here, that in some respects, politicians are afraid of not responding to climate change issues. Everyone forgets that in September of 2000, candidate George W. Bush, even though he rejected the Kyoto Protocol, specifically pledged that if he was elected, he would get new legislation from Congress to regulate greenhouse gases. However, shortly after taking office, in a palace coup engineered by Vice President Dick Cheney, Bush, just less than 2 months after taking office, repudiated that pledge on the bogus grounds that it would make us non-competitive with China and India because they were not required by the Kyoto Protocol to control their emissions. Well, of course, it had been well understood that the reason the Kyoto Protocol only required emissions reductions from the developed countries is because they were the ones that caused the initial problem. The idea was eventually rapidly developing countries would have to be phased in. But Bush then, throughout his administration, continued essentially a do-nothing approach. And even after the Supreme Court in the Massachusetts versus EPA case in 2007 said EPA's refusal to consider regulations to control greenhouse gases was arbitrary and capricious, Bush just left that up to a new administration. Now, in 2008, President Obama is elected president. He immediately, in his first few acts, takes action to reverse the Bush administration denial of the California waiver and to greatly strengthen fuel economy standards at a time when two of the major US automakers were de facto owned by the federal government as a result of the bailout, and strong action to respond to the climate crisis. He also went to Copenhagen in December of 2009 and helped broker the Copenhagen Accord. The day after President Obama was inaugurated, the State Department contacted me and asked if I would be willing to go on a lecture tour of China. And the idea was to talk up among the Chinese intelligentsia the importance of China agreeing at Copenhagen to cap its emissions. I ended up giving 17 lectures in 14 days in all 6 consular regions of China, and I got nothing but pushback. I had been told that even one of my friends, a top public interest environmental lawyer in China, privately thought that climate change was a hoax perpetuated by the West to destroy China's economy. At the Dalian Academy of Sciences, when after my talk, a prominent professor stood up and said, climate change isn't real. If it's real, it's not caused by humans. If it's real and it's caused by humans, China's doing everything it should be, and we don't need to do anything more. Now, also illustrative of the difficulty of democracies in coping with the climate crisis was what happened to Obama's initial cap and trade legislation. It did narrowly pass the House of Representatives, but it actually ended up not getting adopted in the Senate. There were a lot of postmortems on why this happened. Some had said Obama was only going to be able to get one big thing done, and he chose his Obamacare healthcare bill instead. And so Congress did not take action, meaning they were going to rely on Massachusetts versus the EPA and the Clean Power Plan as their way of responding to the climate crisis. I think it's quite illuminating that it was not until after Obama was reelected in November 2012 that he came out with the President's Climate Action Plan, an approach of everything the federal government could do without getting new legislation from Congress to deal with the global climate crisis by taking measures that the president could do on his own to try to reduce US emissions. Now, of course, among the problems, and going back and looking at this history, I found remarkable the similar pattern, how big oil helped kill the BTU tax, helped kill the cap and trade bill, and has killed any discussion of a carbon tax, which most economists believe would be the most efficient way to give everyone an incentive to reduce their emissions. Grist magazine just in this last week touted this study that looks at the public relations firms that were hired by the fossil fuel industry and their strategies that were sort of built on the strategies that the tobacco industry dealt with. And one thing that I found particularly interesting was that the whole notion of a carbon footprint, which was developed by a professor of ecology in the 1990s, it really didn't get traction until a public relations campaign by a major oil company that thought it was the perfect way to get people to not focus on the fossil fuel industry's contribution to climate change, but broadening it so that we all were responsible because we all had a carbon footprint. Now, when I was teaching in China in 2007 and 2008, I was watching carefully what was going on in Australia. And Kevin Rudd, who had been Australia's ambassador to Beijing, spoke perfect Mandarin, had been elected on a platform that said, as soon as I take office, I'm going to ratify the Kyoto Protocol that John Howard had rejected. And he did so. He was elected. He did so. But one of the things that the Labor government did was it adopted a carbon tax. And it turned out the carbon tax was extremely efficient, and it resulted in substantial reductions in Australia's carbon emissions. But the Liberal Party in Australia, the Liberal Party's the Conservatives, everything is upside down there, was able to use public opposition to having to pay more for energy to campaign and successfully defeat the Gillard-Rudd government by demonizing the carbon tax. And the result was that when Tony Abbott took power, the carbon tax was repealed and their emissions went up. Now, China, in the year after I went on my lecture tour there, did a complete 180 on the climate change issue. A year after my lecture tour that had been in May and June of 2009, I was invited to a conference in Beijing about not whether China should cap its emissions, but how it should do so. Should it adopt new legislation, or should it use its existing environmental laws? And ultimately, President Obama and Xi Jinping, who met for the first time in 2013, conducted secret negotiations that resulted in this joint accord between China and the US, where China committed to peak its CO2 emissions around 2030, while striving to peak earlier. Now, I know some conservatives poo-pooed this and said, well, they're not going to do anything until 2030. I spoke at a National Federalist Society lawyers convention, and someone made that point from the audience. The panel I was on was about the Clean Power Plan, and everyone was complaining mightily about all the changes the Clean Power Plan was going to require a state like West Virginia to make. And I said, now what's the deadline for compliance with the Clean Power Plan? 2030. If you're going to have any possibility of complying, you have to act now. Same is true about China. So I love this Tolls cartoon, because now that China was willing to act, it took away one of the principal obstacles to arguments by Republicans about why the United States should not act to control our emissions. And the fact that China was able to act relatively swiftly to change its environmental policies, I think is actually attributable in part to how bad environmental conditions got in China. There were actually public protests because environmental conditions had gotten so bad. You couldn't see across the street some days. They had airpocalypses. Premier Li Keqiang in 2014 ended up declaring war on pollution. And I argue in the chapter that I wrote for the book, Constitutional Democracy in Crisis, that in fact, the party felt that even though it's a completely authoritarian government, and now much more so than it was when I was teaching there in 2007, 2008, or in my more recent trips to China, they felt the need to respond to environmental issues. They created environmental courts. I twice ended up giving lectures to those new judges for the environmental courts, more than 800 of them. In 2014, after they declared war on pollution, I actually testified before the National People's Congress that was considering how to make their laws more enforceable and whether or not they should require daily penalties. I joined a group that included a lawyer from NRDC, Dave Pettit, and Jim Holtkamp from Holland and Hart, a mining industry lawyer. And to the delight of the B.A. Tao, the general counsel of China's environmental agency, The Standing Committee, when it amended their basic environmental law in 2014, included virtually everything we had recommended. And when I spoke to the judges in 2016, I got to meet the Chief Justice of the Supreme People's Court, who ended up giving a speech telling the judges rule in favor of the environment, and then was treated to a 2.5-hour speech by Xi Jinping, who had been China's top climate negotiator, who Xi Jinping just brought out of retirement to be China's chief climate negotiator at the Glasgow COP26. Now, of course, shortly after, this was June of 2016, we then had the US election in November, and Donald Trump was elected, and I had to laugh at the irony when I saw that previously he had tweeted the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese, given how much pushback. He actually promised during the campaign to cancel the Paris Agreement that John Kerry and Xi Jinping had played a major role in negotiating on June 1st of 2017. He pulled us out of Paris. I actually think he thought that, of course, if the US pulled out of Paris, the Chinese, who had no real interest in dealing with the global climate crisis, would also pull out. But instead, they did just the opposite. They said it was an unfortunate development, but they reiterated their intention to honor their commitment. And one dramatic way in which democracy worked, at least not without some stumbles, was the election of Joe Biden, who had pledged that on day one, I'm going to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. And that's exactly what he did. He issued an executive order directing that the US rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. And after the 30-day period was up, the US did officially rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, the infrastructure legislation that the Biden administration has prepared has been designed to be part of this all of government approach to dealing with the global climate crisis and also to promote environmental justice. One aspect of it, though, that died quite quickly was the notion of a carbon tax. It was announced that Joe Biden had an utter lack of interest in including a carbon tax as part of this. And I think that reflects that the administration has learned some important political lessons. The effects of climate change are becoming more visible. Here, I love this tweet from Dick Baylor that to call a carbon tax dead on arrival is an insult to dead things. They were once alive, sad but true. The current state of the climate, it seems like every time the IPCC weighs in, it's even happening even faster and going to be much worse than they previously thought. And yet countries are still behind on meeting the relatively small pledges that they made in Paris in 2015. Every year, the UN comes up with its emissions gap report. And as we all know, as a result of Stockholm, while some progress has been made, we're not anywhere close to achieving the Paris goal of keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and hopefully as little as 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, and of course, one big issue is the funding that the developed countries are supposed to provide developing countries. China still argues at times that it's a developing country. And in fact, there's still considerable poverty in the rural areas, although hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. And many people argued there actually was a debate when I was there in 2008 over how do we make a transition to democracy. And some scholar had proposed that we split the Communist Party in two and have them run against each other. It was kind of considered inevitable from globalization that China would make a democratic transition. In fact, just the opposite has happened as Xi Jinping has cemented power. The regime is now more repressive than ever and authoritarian, and yet it too has to deal with the reality that you can't just go stop all coal use in the country because if the government takes too much of a heavy hand in doing that, you're going to get pushback. And I think that was one reason why, although the US and China, just like they did the year before the Paris Agreement, during the Glasgow COP26, issued their own joint declaration about how they would continue to work together to control global emissions. And it's probably the most hopeful area of cooperation between the US and China that still remains. The Chinese were somewhat constrained in what they could promise, in part because of concerns about what was happening to the domestic economy. Now, in the US, we face this partisan gridlock right now that's stalling major legislation in Congress. The Baker-Schultz bipartisan climate roadmap that relied largely on a carbon tax is not something that has had any traction. Yet you've seen, because the climate problem has become more apparent, that even people who previously were climate change deniers, like Jerry Taylor of the Cato Institute, who left to form the Niskanen Center, or Bob Inglis, the former Republican congressman who got handily defeated by Trey Gowdy, in large part because he had advocated for a carbon tax and dealing with climate problems. Conservatives are starting to come around, although they have very different approaches. And even though 60 members of Congress, led by Representative John Curtis, I'm sorry, that's not Nevada, it's Utah. I'll change it right now. Okay. John Curtis of Utah has 60 members of the Conservative Climate Caucus, but they're not volunteering to provide votes for measures that go beyond carbon taxes. Also, the Biden administration is now hamstrung by a conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, even though it made a good strategic move in deciding not to revive the Clean Power Plan because it could count the votes, and knew that even though it had been upheld in the DC Circuit in the American Lung Association decision issued last January 19th, it said it wasn't going to revive it. That didn't stop the Supreme Court, though, however, from deciding to grant cert, and was essentially asking the coal companies and red states, asking for an advisory opinion to tell EPA they can't regulate under the Clean Air Act. Justin Walker, the youngest member of the DC Circuit, who was quickly confirmed when the Republicans still controlled the Senate a year ago, in his dissent in the American Lung Association case, raises the major questions doctrine that would effectively say that EPA is powerless to do anything that would have a huge effect on the economy. So we'll see what happens in that case. Now, of course, one of the biggest changes in recent years has been from corporate governance. And I think the shocking election last May of 3 members of the board, the 12-member board of ExxonMobil, who were campaigning as independent directors, not endorsed by the company and fiercely opposed by Darren Woods, the CEO of ExxonMobil, said the company's performing poorly financially because it's been such a Neanderthal on issues like climate change. And in June, a lobbyist for Exxon, who had been dealing with Congress, was subject to a sting by Greenpeace, where he admitted that the reason Exxon had long nominally supported a carbon tax was because they knew Congress would never adopt it. Now that Woods faces 1/4 of his board of directors being critical of him for their policies on the environment, he's starting to change his tune a little, but I thought it was so revealing that when he was campaigning against these directors, he said the reason ExxonMobil had not adopted one of the net zero pledges that have become so fashionable now from fossil fuel companies is because none of the other companies were being honest. They had no plans to go net zero. They were setting impossibly long deadlines when the current management would no longer be around. He said he was just being more honest. Now ExxonMobil's trying to look at maybe canceling some projects for the future. We'll see what ultimately happens. Now, one thing that I was hopeful of in the article in 2018, in that chapter, was the fact that even if the Trump administration took action at the federal level to make it difficult to respond to the global climate crisis, the states were acting in a bipartisan alliance. The We Are Still In coalition and the U.S. Climate Alliance that included even Republican governors. Now, of course, there have been some disappointments. Voters in Washington state have twice voted down a carbon tax in a referendum. Governor Lamont of Connecticut also said that he couldn't get such a scheme adopted even when gas prices were low. Now, so is there hope? Well, here's a couple of pieces of good news in addition to the 3 directors being elected at Exxon. The Kigali Agreement, historic agreement to phase out hydrofluorocarbons. And a huge obstacle to it was this decision by the DC Circuit authored by Judge Brett Kavanaugh shortly before he joined the Supreme Court. But because it was so important to both industry and environmentalists, Congress now has passed new legislation effectively overturning Kavanaugh's decision, and EPA is being able to take action there. Also somewhat hopeful, I think the Biden administration's following the right approach by, even though there's substantial evidence of erosion of democracy in the United States. We all know what happened on January 6th, and we're finding out even scarier details by the day. For the last 40 years, I've lived on Capitol Hill. I heard the sirens and the buses taking the National Guard troops to the Capitol. And we've also seen the hyper-politicization of our court system. The Summit of Democracy seems to have struck a chord because the countries who weren't invited, including China, are now going to great lengths to say how important democracy is. The Chinese State Council last Friday released this document, China, Democracy That Works, where they said democracy is a common value of humanity and an ideal that has always been cherished by the Communist Party. And they also included this paragraph that I think would drive any legal writing instructor crazy if their first-year student authored it. Whole process, people's democracy, integrates process-oriented democracy with results-oriented democracy, procedural democracy with substantive democracy, direct democracy with indirect democracy, and people's democracy with the will of the state. It's a model of socialist democracy that covers all aspects of the democratic process and all sectors of society. It's a true democracy that works. They argue that our elections are all corrupt because they're tainted by huge campaign donations from various industry groups. And while it's true that China is able to cow industry because the Communist Party is so powerful. I would submit that China is anything but a democracy. In fact, on the last lecture that I gave for the China University of Political Science and Law last June, I was asked to change my title because it included the word election. It was from Trump to Biden, how the US presidential election is transforming US environmental policies. So while China has been able at times to act more swiftly because it's an authoritarian regime controlled by the Communist Party, they still have to worry about letting environmental problems get so far out of hand that the people end up potentially undermining their rule. So is this optimistic or pessimistic? I don't know. I think the only thing that will tell is whether or not the Biden administration is successful in the US in dealing with the forces that have been eroding our democracy. One thing that Biden has done that hasn't gotten much attention, he has nominated and had confirmed more federal judges than any other first-term president has at this portion of his term. He's greatly diversifying the federal judiciary, and that will help combat the politicization of the courts. He did not respond to the Supreme Court by saying, we're just going to increase the size of the court and install our own people there. So I think that in the long run is hopeful for democracy, while at the same time considering reforms like term limits for Supreme Court justices. So I'm somewhat hopeful there. I'll stop sharing my screen now. I know I've talked for too long, but I'll open it up for questions.
All right, thank you so much. That was fantastic, a great review of so many issues and taking us through what the history. And I'm gonna take the moderator's prerogative to ask the first question, but to remind everyone, please feel free to write your questions in the chat. We have a relatively small audience, so if somebody wants to raise their hand, that's fine as well. But just to start out, you talked about the problem with creating policies that can withstand reversals, right? That it's very difficult to get things going so that it's safe or a long-term policy that will continue for a while. And I was reminded of the issues about harnessing the incentives of the private sector. As you know, recently, and you alluded to this with ExxonMobil and engine number one, there's been a lot of writing and thoughts about, well, the private sector may be helping, doing something, pushing. If we can align the private sector's incentives with the government, then maybe that will help us over this hump of getting things done. And I was thinking again about your discussion about carbon taxes versus, say, cap and trade. So two questions. Do you see that there's hope to use the private sector to do this or help with this without it smothering democracy, the democratic process? And if so, does that point us toward policies that incent the private sector? So cap and trade, the private sector has incentive to keep it going. Carbon tax, they don't. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think, I just recently spoke at the National Federalist Society convention. They had a program on, I wasn't on this panel, but called Woke Capitalism. I mean, the same people who argue for a libertarian approach are so upset when a private corporation wants to do something that's pro-environment. And I submit that the reason these companies have been woke in the sense of revising their policies on the climate crisis is because they want to appeal to their shareholders. And they know that if they continue their strategy of climate denial and disinformation, which they may ultimately be held to account for in some of these state level fraud suits, that have been wandering their way through the courts, delayed for a year by the Supreme Court this year in the decision on the reviewability of remand orders in cases removed to federal courts, that they're not going to do well in the marketplace. While it's a different kind of voting, dollar voting, rather than one person, one vote, that's part of responding to public opinion. And I think the Biden administration has been somewhat sophisticated in trying to figure out how can we align policies that will reward companies for moving in a greener direction, even though a lot of that stuff has ended up being dropped from the ultimate legislation. One of the things that you discover if you go back and look at the Clinton BTU tax and the Obama cap and trade legislation is there always seems to be a problem of senators who've come out strongly in favor of things like had happened with Lindsey Graham coming out and Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich saying we all can work together on climate policies, that when it gets to the parties demanding strict party discipline because we don't want the other side to have victory, there are defections. And there's the Joe Manchins of this era are repeated in the past by senators who look like they were on board legislation who then end up defecting. So it's always going to be hugely difficult to put together a political coalition to win. One area where the Biden administration has been quite frank about our dependence on the private sector is financing. The administration, I think just yesterday said, we're not capable as a government to finance all the investments that are going to have to be made to make the transition to a green economy. And so getting banks on board, and that's one thing that seemed to happen at the Glasgow COP, that there was much greater participation by global bankers there. I remember hearing in that speech from Xi Jinping back in 2016 that he said, we are going to have to fundamentally change the Chinese economy to a green civilization. And that's going to be really hard for us to do. It may be much easier for them to get things passed by the National People's Congress when Xi Jinping's effort to get rid of term limits and let him serve for life was voted on by them. It was approved 2,598 to 2 in a supposedly secret ballot. I wonder what happened to the two who dared oppose him. But certainly the private sector is going to have to be a major part of any solution.
When you said the votes, it reminded me that you only need 51 votes out of 100 to get something done politically, but for a private industry, every dollar counts. So even a minority of people can push in that way. We have two really great questions, and I will start with one from Mark Nevitt. His question was whether the COP27 negotiations in Egypt will be a more difficult place for progress, precisely because Egypt is not an open democracy and thus would not allow protesters to put pressure on the negotiators. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think you're right that the venue is not great from the standpoint of protests. It brings to mind when there was the COP in Poland and the Polish government was openly advocating for a greater expansion of its coal industry, and particularly dirty coal that they have. That was not nice optics for holding a COP. So I suspect there's been a lot of controversy because of who was invited to the Summit of Democracies and who wasn't. Some countries that have been invited are not necessarily robust democracies, shall we say. Egypt is certainly in that category of a country that greatly controls protests. Now, at times, these cops have become almost a circus because, well, protesters, one thing that I think did happen at COP26, though, is that it got far more media attention than ever before, at least here in the United States. Reporters who previously just, well, this is too beyond our pay grade, we're paying a lot of attention. And I kind of wonder if now these cops in the future will attract a whole lot more international media attention than the every 10-year summit. In Stockholm next summer, there's supposed to be the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Declaration and the original Stockholm Conference that set in motion this every 10-year meeting. I suspect now that maybe these climate cops will become even more important than those global summits.
Yes. The last question, and speaking of Egypt as not being a full democracy, this sort of talked about how the U.S. is seen as slipping in its democratic goals, and how we also saw slippage at that time in climate, although we've seen a rebound with Biden. Sort of as an ending point, I think the thrust of the question is, are we better off with climate policies with really strong democracies and maybe autocratic systems, but the flawed democracies are more problematic in the middle? So this is a chance for you to pitch what you really think here, Bob, about what is the best political system to help us with the climate crisis.
Well, I'm certainly painfully aware that we live in a flawed democracy, because for the last 42 years since I came to clerk with Justice White, I've lived in the District of Columbia. I have zero voting representation in Congress. My neighbor, Eleanor Holmes Norton, gets to hang out there, but she can't vote on anything that actually counts. So we live in a very flawed democracy, and we have to work every night and day to combat the forces that would make it even more flawed. And those forces are now being unleashed by various parties, and we'll see who wins out. Ultimately, I would not advocate for an autocratic system to protect the climate. I hope we aren't going to live in such a dystopian world where the climate catastrophe becomes so great that governments then use that as an excuse to seize more authoritarian powers. Michael, I note, clerked for Justice White like I did. I believe he was the year after I was. And it's great to see him here. I wish we could be doing this in person. It was the ALS meeting in 2020, I guess. That was the last time I saw Michael in person.
Yes. We all wish that, but it's good to see people here, and this also allows the reach around the globe. So I want to thank you again for a really provocative topic, and I don't think we have seen the last of this topic. And I encourage our audience to go to our website to see a recording of this and recordings of the other transition law and governance. Again, along with Tracy Hester and Gina Warren, I'm Victor Flatt, the co-director of the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Center at the University of Houston Law Center, where we try to focus on the intersection of environment, energy, and climate policy. Again, thanks to Aubin Nzaou and the Transition Law and Governance, the Université de Lyon 3, and the European Union's Marie Skłodowska-Curie grant. Thank you all so much, and I will post the CLE slide for anyone who's interested, but it's been great to see all of you, and I look forward to our next program, which will be next week. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay.
All right, that's all. Thank you. Bye, Aubin.